Greetings. I have been asked to speak to you about the history of Eastern Europe in the first half of the 20th century, with special reference to the Holocaust and its origins. My name is Timothi Снайдер. I'm a historian at Yale University. Before I proceed, I want to make sure to thank you for taking the time to listen to this lecture, for taking the time to do what you do at home. I appreciate your work as educators and as museum curators. The history of the Holocaust is a very important thing to preserve around the world, and I'm very glad to have this chance to express my appreciation for what you do in that respect. My job today is to give a kind of introduction to a part of the world over half a century. This is not an easy job. Eastern Europe is a big, complicated region. A half century is a long period of time, and the Holocaust is, of course, a complex subject. I'll be speaking to you for about 45 minutes, which doesn't leave us very much time. So what I'll be doing is I'll be sticking to the essentials, trying to make a few clear points, which I hope will be helpful to you along the way. The first point, when we talk about Eastern Europe, at the very beginning of the 20th century, we have to remember that we're speaking about a world that is still a world of empire. In and around the year 1900, we don't have a world of nation states. We have a world of empires and colonies. The countries that dominate the world are maritime empires such as Great Britain or the Netherlands or France. Countries that dominate Eastern Europe are land empires such as the Russian Empire or the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg monarchy, the German Empire. At this time in history, around the year 1900, most of the Jews in the world live in these East European empires. A good number in the Ottoman Empire, by far the largest number in the Russian Empire. And as you know, the reason why the largest number of Jews in the world live in the Russian Empire is because the Russian Empire took over most of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which until the 18th century was the home of more Jews than any other country. In addition to these empires, these maritime empires, these land empires, there's a new important country which is rising in Europe, and that country is Germany. Germany comes into existence in 1871 as a nation state, but immediately tries to become an empire. It takes over possessions in Africa, and it rules over Poles in Eastern Europe in an imperial fashion. So this is the first point, which is very important to establish. The world is a world of empire, and in many ways, Eastern Europe is at the center of that empire. Eastern Europe is governed by empires as of 1900. This structure of the world is going to change, of course, in 1914. So the second important topic that we have to speak for a moment about is the First World War. What was the First World War? How does it fundamentally change the history of Eastern Europe? How does it change the shape of Eastern Europe? How does it change the history of Jews in particular in Eastern Europe? So what was the First World War and where did it come from? The First World War has to do with the emergence of the national question. If the world in the early 20th century was still a world of empire, the challenge to that world, the challenge that was emerging was the national question, the idea that empires should be broken up into nation states. And the site of that challenge, the location of that challenge was the Balkans. Nation states had existed in the Balkans from the early 19th century. Greece and Serbia are examples of early nation states. They were joined with time with Romania, a bit later in 1908 by Bulgaria. These new nation states were formed from the territories of the Ottoman Empire. These new nation states were an early example of what was to come later in much of the rest of the world, which is decolonization. But these early nation states, these Balkan nation states, also showed the limits of a nation state. They showed that nation states are often insufficient unto themselves economically. Much of the 19th century in the Balkans was a matter of wars between individual Balkan nation states until in the early 20th century, in 1912 and 1913 in particular, the Balkan states realized they could together make war against the Ottoman Empire. That was the First Balkan War of 1912. After they defeated the Ottoman Empire in 1912, Balkan nation states then made war against each other. That was the Second Balkan War of 1913. The First World War that begins in 1914 begins really as the Third Balkan War. It is in effect a conflict over territory between Serbia and the Habsburg monarchy, a conflict over territory between a small nation state and a big empire, which then spills into a European conflict and then a world conflict. So in order to see the shape of the world then that emerges from the First World War, we have to see and remember who is fighting against whom. So the First World War in Europe is an imperial war. I need to make this point over and over again. It's a war between empires. That's the entire reason why we call it a world war, is that it was a war not between nation states, but between empires. On the one side, you have the Habsburg monarchy, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire. On the other side, you have the French, also an empire, the British, an empire, the Russian Empire, and later on, the Americans. The First World War, as everyone knows, was a terrifyingly bloody war. Technologies and tactics of war that have been used around the world and empires were suddenly used in Europe itself. And the consequence of this war, the interesting consequence of this war, the thing which is worth knowing, is that one kind of empire lost. That is, the land empires lost. This is a kind of coincidence, but it's fateful for the Jews and it's fateful for the shape of Europe thereafter. Some empires won and some empires lost. And the empires that won were the maritime empires. The British win, the French win. The empires that lost, the German Empire, the Habsburg monarchy, the Ottoman Empire, they were land empires. They lose and they fall apart or they're broken apart. The Russian Empire here is a very special case. The Russian Empire was, of course, on the winning side of the war, but the Russian Empire was broken up by revolution in 1917, so that it too became one more land empire that fell apart by the end of the First World War. So the end of the First World War leads to two very new developments in Eastern Europe. The first is the principle of national self-determination. The Balkan nation states had already existed before 1914. After 1914, the principle that there should be a nation state spreads northwards from the Balkans. This principle, called national self-determination, is endorsed by, above all, the Americans, and it becomes the basis for the peace settlements. So a new state called Poland is created, a new state called Czechoslovakia is created, a new state called Austria, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, the three Baltic states are all created on the basis of national self-determination. Further east, in most of the Russian Empire, something else happens, which is the end of the Russian Empire means 3 or 4 years of civil war before a Soviet Union is established. And these 3 or 4 years of civil war, 1917, 1918, 1919, 1920, into 1921, these years of civil war are particularly significant for the Jews. The history of the civil war in the Russian Empire is of a conflict between the so-called whites, people who wanted the restoration of the empire, the Reds, the communists, the people who win in the end. But there were also parties to this, other parties to this war, such as the Ukrainians, various Ukrainian forces trying to establish a Ukrainian state, and of course the Poles and others take part in this war as well. From the point of view of Jewish history, the essential moment or the essential element that has to be remembered are the terrible pogroms of 1919. In fact, the word pogrom is really no longer the right word to apply here, because historically a pogrom is an event in which a few people are injured or killed, or maybe a few dozen people are injured or killed. But the events that took place in Ukraine in 1919 were on a completely different scale, and I would say of a different quality. During this conflict between Reds and Whites and Ukrainians, the Jews were associated with the Communist Revolution and were systematically killed in villages and towns all across Ukraine, basically by every party concerned, by the Poles, by the Whites, by the Reds, although most significantly by the Ukrainian army. And Jews were killed on the scale of tens of thousands. Nothing like this, it's worth emphasizing, had ever happened before in history, at least in modern history. More Jews were probably killed in these events than in the terrible events of the 17th century, which Jewish history, of course, recalls. So this was something quite new. All right, so now we have to rebalance the picture. At the end of the First World War, we have these new nation states in Eastern Europe, including Poland, where several million Jews live. And east of that, we have this new entity at the end of the Russian Civil Wars, which is called the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is established in December of 1922. These two countries, neighboring countries, very different countries, but neighboring countries, Poland and the Soviet Union, are home to by far the largest number of Jews in Europe. And then to set the picture again, we need to consider two durable elements. The first is that from the point of view of Western Europe, maritime empires continue and prosper. The French and the British are going to continue to think their way of governing and ruling is normal. The Americans who win the war are also going to continue to think their way of governing and ruling is normal. In Central and Eastern Europe, however, the very idea of normality, I think it's fair to say, has been challenged or even shattered. Not just the scale of the destruction of the war, but the fact of the revolution in Russia, and also the shock of defeat for the German army are such that many things which hadn't been imaginable before 1918 become imaginable after 1918. The bandwidth, the spectrum of what seems to be possible grows much wider in 1917, 1918, 1919. Now, the third major point, or the third major subject that we have to grapple with as we discuss the history of Eastern Europe in the early part of the 20th century, is the Soviet Union. Now, of course, there's much to say about the Soviet Union. It's the first Marxist state in the history of the world. It introduces a new form of politics, Lenin's so-called democratic centralism. It's an experiment in economic development, which is then copied around the world later in the 20th century. For our purposes, though, as I understand them, the most important thing is to come to terms with the history of violence. So let me briefly try to do that here. The Soviet Union was by far the most violent state in Eastern Europe in the 1920s, and especially in the 1930s. The first element of violence was the collectivization of agriculture between 1928 and 1933. In the 1920s, the Soviet Union had both allowed for free markets in agricultural territory, and it had promoted various national non-Russian minorities with policies of affirmative action. Under Stalin, between 1928 and 1933, both of those policies were reversed. Land was controlled by the state, and affirmative action policies were either reversed or slowed down. The most violent example of these two reversals was in Ukraine in 1932 and 1933, where it looks like more than 3, probably closer to 4 million inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine were starved to death. There was also mass famine in Kazakhstan and mass famine in southern Russia at about the same time. The second major episode of violence in the Soviet Union was the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938, which had two parts. The largest part of the Great Terror was aimed at peasants, so-called kulaks, who were thought to be disloyal. The second largest part of the terror was aimed at national minorities, Poles, Latvians, and others who were regarded as having connections to other countries around the world and therefore as being potentially dangerous to the Soviet Union. In the Great Terror, something like 700,000 Soviet citizens were shot to death. So this is a scale of violence which is much greater than anything else in Eastern Europe at the time, and will remain on a scale of its own, of course, until the rise of Nazi Germany. Fourth point. In Eastern Europe itself, that is, in the countries to the west of the Soviet Union, we follow a different pattern of history. In the non-Soviet parts of Eastern Europe, the basic trajectory, in fact, the basic trajectory in all of Europe, if we want to make a generalization, is that democracies fail, and they fail all the more quickly after the Great Depression. This is a pattern which is set in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, where democracy fails at the very beginning, is never really established, is confirmed in Poland, where democracy comes to an end or is replaced by what we now call managed democracy in 1926. In Romania, the far right has come to power by the late 1930s. But the general trend is that these democratic nation states, which were established on the basis of parliamentarism, fail as democracies, if not in the 1920s, then in the 1930s. Now, their failure as democracies takes place against the background of the rise of Nazi Germany. This is very important. Eastern Europe was not itself the center of the history of fascism or National Socialism, but it was very much affected by the rise of fascism and National Socialism. Fascism, of course, means the government established by Benito Mussolini in Italy in 1923. National Socialism means the Nazi Party of Adolf Hitler, which manages to come to power in 1933. The years between 1933 and 1939 are above all a time of concessions to a rising and a consolidating National Socialist Germany. This is true wherever you look. It's true if you look to Western Europe, where France does nothing as Germany reclaims territory on the French-German border and illegally rebuilds its army and air force. It's true in Southern Europe, where Mussolini's fascist Italy recognizes that Hitler is going to be the most important power of the far right. It's also true in much of Eastern Europe, where Hungary and Romania are drawn towards Germany by trade pacts in the second half of the 1930s. We can see the significance of this trend in the Munich Agreement of September 1938, when the British and the French, along with the Italians, accept that Germany should be allowed to take territory from Czechoslovakia. This was a particularly significant concession to Nazi Germany because, for one thing, Czechoslovakia was an ally of the Western powers, and for another, Czechoslovakia was the last remaining democracy at the time in Central or Eastern Europe. So Munich in 1938 demonstrates the rise of Germany and also the willingness of surrounding powers to make concessions. And we should pause here, because even before we get to the Second World War, we can see here in the late 1930s that these concessions are very significant to the history of the Jews. How so? Well, let's look at them more closely. One concession, which I didn't mention, but which I should, is the Anschluss of Austria in March of 1938. In March of 1938, Austria ceases to exist. It very quickly becomes part of Germany in what's known as the Anschluss. This is incredibly significant for the history of what we think of as the Holocaust. In March 1938, Jews suddenly cease to be citizens of Austria. They're cut free of citizenship from Austria. As a result of this, in a few short weeks, the Jews of Austria can be persecuted more thoroughly than the Jews of Germany were. In other words, a few weeks or a few months of being cut off completely from state protection leaves the Jews more vulnerable in Austria than the Jews in Germany had been in the 1930s. More violence can be unleashed more quickly against the Jews of Austria after Anschluss in a few months in 1938 than was used against Jews in Germany in the several years of Nazi power in Germany up to that point. Second example is the destruction of Czechoslovakia. I mentioned that some of Czechoslovak territory was given to Germany in September of 1938 at Munich. By March of 1939, Czechoslovakia as a country had ceased to exist. When Czechoslovakia as a country ceases to exist, it's the Jews who suffer the most. The Jews in the Czech parts of the country, seeing what has happened to Austrian Jews, try to flee. The Jews in the Slovak part of the country are under the government of a new Slovak state that is a puppet of Nazi Germany. And here you see something a bit similar to what happened in Austria. Because Slovakia is a new state with a new constitution, suddenly Jews are cut off completely from all legal and constitutional protections. And when a new Slovak constitution is written, it defines the Jews as being second-class citizens without, for example, the right to property. As a result of that, Jews are suddenly very poor. And then the new Slovak government can say to itself, what are we going to do with all of these poor Jews? And what's the answer? The answer is we send them to Auschwitz. The very first large transport of European Jews to Auschwitz was the Slovak Jews. And then if we look even further east in Czechoslovakia, the far eastern province of Czechoslovakia was something called Subcarpathian Ruthenia. What happens to the Jews there? Well, Subcarpathian Ruthenia is given to Hungary. Hungary does not recognize these Jews as its citizens at all. Later in 1941, when Germany invades the Soviet Union, Hungary pushes these Jews eastward into the route of the Wehrmacht. And then these Jews, these formerly Czechoslovak Jews, who lose their citizenship in Czechoslovakia and never get Hungarian citizenship, these Jews are murdered in Kamyanets-Podilsky in what's now Western Ukraine in the very first, very large massacre of the Holocaust in 1941. So the point I'm trying to make is that the destruction of the European order, the destruction of European states in the late 1930s is significant in that it creates conditions which allows the thing that we know as the Holocaust to take place. Okay, this brings me to the most significant concession to Hitler, which was made in the late 1930s. The most significant concession to Hitler that was made by the Soviet Union. In August and September of 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is a non-aggression agreement with secret protocols about dividing up territory in Eastern Europe. In September, they sign a treaty on borders and friendship. This is a treaty they sign after they have both jointly invaded Poland. So the beginning of the Second World War in Europe is a German war with Soviet support, which destroys the Polish state. Now, this is a story which we have to get straight before we talk about the Holocaust. Because if we're going to understand the Holocaust, what we have to have clear is what happens to the Jews in Poland and the Soviet Union. Not just because these are the largest groups of Jews in Eastern Europe, but because in the case of the Soviet Jews, these are the first Jews to die in very large numbers. So the next thing we have to do is to try to get this history straight. So in the autumn of 1939, Poland is destroyed by German armed force and by Soviet armed force. On the German side, territory is incorporated into Germany. Poles and Jews alike lose their citizenship. Poles and later Jews are deported from territories annexed to Germany into a German colony also made from Polish territory, which is called the Generalgouvernement. The other thing which is worth noticing about these weeks and months are the Einsatzgruppen. When Germany invades Poland in 1939, it uses special forces, special units called Einsatzgruppen, who are chiefly tasked to murder the Polish elites. They also murder some Jews, but their main task at this time is to murder the Polish elites. On the Soviet side, in Eastern Poland, there is also the destruction of the Polish state. There's also the destruction of the Polish elite. There's also the claim that Poland has never properly existed. In 1940, the Soviets moved forward also and destroyed the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Now, why am I mentioning this as part of the history of Eastern Europe and the Holocaust? Well, of course, it's important as part of the history of Eastern Europe. We can't possibly understand the history of Eastern Europe without knowing that the Baltic states were destroyed in 1940. But it's also very important for the history of the Holocaust for a reason that I've alluded to before. And that is that when states are destroyed, it's the minorities who are most at risk. And what was special about 1939, 1940, 1941 is that states in a certain part of Eastern Europe were destroyed not once, but twice, or occupied not once, but twice. The fact that the Soviet Union occupied the Baltic states before the Germans then came is going to be fateful to what happens to the Jews, which I'll try to explain. Okay. So now we've arrived at the War of 1941. We're 4 decades into the 20th century. We're in the middle of the Second World War, and we're at the place in the Second World War which is crucial to Jews. As of June 1941, the Jews of Western and Central Poland are in ghettos where they've been placed by the Germans with local Polish help. But the Holocaust as such has not begun. Jews are dying in horrible numbers in the ghettos in the winter of 1940 to 1941, but the mass killing of Jews as such has not begun. It begins in June of 1941 when Germany invades the Soviet Union. So now what happens now is a bit complicated because when Germany invades the Soviet Union, what is it really invading? It's invading at the beginning the territories that the Soviet Union has just taken from Poland, or the territories that the Soviet Union has just taken from the Baltic states. The Western Soviet Union in 1941 is made up of territory that hadn't belonged to the Soviet Union in 1939. So what this means is that when the Germans invade, they claim that Soviet power was the fault of the Jews. And they try very hard to inspire pogroms or killings of Jews using this logic. The most notorious example of where this worked is in a Polish town or village really called Jedwabne. Something similar took place in a couple dozen Polish towns and villages. It also took place in several dozen Ukrainian towns and villages where local people, organized and very often directly helped by Germans, killed Jews with the idea that somehow the Jews are to be blamed for the previous Soviet regime. Now, this is, of course, outrageously unfair, and very often the people who were killing Jews, claiming that Jews were collaborators, were actually themselves collaborators who thought that in killing Jews, they could, so to speak, clear their own names. But nevertheless, we can't overlook the fact that there is a political component here, especially in the Baltic states. Because the Soviet Union had destroyed the Baltic states, the Germans had a very powerful set of political emotions to work with. The Germans were able to use the resentments and the anger of people who had lost their state in ways that sometimes served German purposes. And that includes the collaboration in the mass murder of Jews. Now, of course, local collaboration had many sources. Very often it was not political. Sometimes it had to do with anti-Semitism. Sometimes it had to do with simply collaborating for reasons of convenience or personal safety. One thing which is worth noticing, if we're thinking about Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, is that people collaborated everywhere. Essentially, everyone collaborated. There was no ethnic group in your part of the world that did not collaborate. It's very convenient for one ethnic group to say that another ethnic group collaborated, but all the ethnic groups collaborated. The Germans had as much collaboration as they needed everywhere they went. And this included, as they got further east, the pre-war Soviet Union. So when the Germans arrived in pre-war Soviet Ukraine, pre-war Soviet Belarus, pre-war Soviet Russia, they also found as many collaborators as they needed. And by the way, communists also collaborated. Some of the most important collaborators in the Soviet Union had been notable communists. All right. Crucial to the beginning of the Holocaust, though, is not just collaboration. Probably more important are the German institutions and the German techniques. The German institutions that carried out the Holocaust in the Soviet Union in 1941 were the Einsatzgruppen, as I've already mentioned, but also regular German policemen. At every massacre, at every large massacre of Jews in 1941 and afterwards in the Soviet Union, the regular German police played a part. The Wehrmacht, the German army, played a very significant part in the Holocaust. The technique, of course, was mass shooting. The technique by which the Holocaust began was not gassing, but shooting, and the place was the occupied Soviet Union. Now, since we're speaking about the Holocaust, but also about violence in Eastern Europe in general, it's important to note that the Germans had two other policies of mass killing inside the Soviet Union, aside from the mass killing of Jews. The first was starvation. Most remembered is the starvation of Leningrad, the starvation siege of Leningrad, but even more Soviet citizens were murdered as prisoners of war in makeshift German camps all across the Western Soviet Union. Something like 3 million Soviet prisoners of war were starved to death, which is the largest German crime in the Second World War after the Holocaust. The third major German atrocity in the Soviet Union were so-called anti-partisan campaigns, which were centered especially in the Soviet Republic of Belarus. As a response to Soviet partisan activity, Germans destroyed entire villages and towns. Later, they created what were known as dead zones, whole areas where anyone who was alive would either be taken as slave labor or be killed. As a result of this, it was Belarus, which in fact was the territory, not just in the Eastern Europe of the Soviet Union, but the territory in the entire world, which had the greatest losses per share of population during the Second World War between 1941 and 1945. So the Holocaust begins in the Soviet Union in 1941 with shooting. This is my next point. How does the Holocaust continue? By the end of 1941, about 1 million Jews have been murdered over death pits by shooting. By the end of 1941, the Germans are experimenting with new forms of killing. The Germans have experienced killing the handicapped using carbon monoxide. That technique will also be brought to bear against the Jews. In German camps, such as Auschwitz, experiments in killing are carried out. For example, Soviet prisoners of war at Auschwitz are killed with a pesticide, hydrogen cyanide, which went under the trade name of Zyklon B. And that, of course, was the agent which would later be used to murder Jews in Auschwitz. So the technique of killing, gassing, is developed at the end of 1941. And then it's applied on a mass scale in Poland in 1942, chiefly against the Jews of Poland. I began by saying that Europe in the first part of the 20th century was part of a world of empire. It's hard for us to imagine this now, but it's essential for us to imagine it, not least if we want to understand just how the Germans were thinking about the Jews and what they were going to do with them. Until quite late in the day, the German leadership had the idea, we might say the fantasy, that Jews were going to be sent somewhere very far away. That's what happened in the imperial world. You could just banish people very far away. The Jews could be sent, one idea went, deep into the Soviet Union. Perhaps they could be sent to the Gulag, but of course the Soviet Union was never defeated. Another idea was the Jews can be sent to Madagascar, to an island off the coast of Africa. That was actually the main idea in 1940, but that of course proves to be impossible. So Jews who are in ghettos in Poland are there because the Germans have the idea that they're going to be sent far away. In 1941, Germans realize that it's possible to kill Jews in large numbers, to murder them where they live. Then in 1942, there's simply a change of technique, gassing rather than shooting. The shooting continues in the Soviet Union. In occupied Poland, the new technique is gassing. At Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Helmno, the Germans began to take the Jews who were already gathered in ghettos and transport them by train to these death facilities. I call them death facilities rather than camps, because these were not really camps. These were not places where people lived. These were places where people were taken to die, death facilities or death factories. So by the end of 1942, the Holocaust has already claimed the lives of the vast majority of Soviet Jews under German control, and also the majority of Polish Jews under German control. The next stage of the Holocaust is the extension of the Holocaust around the rest of Europe. And here there are a couple of quick points that I want to make. One of them is a point that I want to reiterate. The history of the Holocaust is chiefly a history of your part of the world. It's chiefly a history of the Soviet Union, of the Western Soviet Union. It's chiefly a history of Poland, because these are the places where most of the Jews lived. These are also the places where the death rates of Jews were extremely high. Poland and the Soviet Union are, of course, very different countries in many different ways. But it's interesting to note that the death rates of Jews in both places was about the same, ranging between about 95% and about 98%. So most of the Jews lived in these places, and this is the place where the Holocaust, these are the places where the Holocaust was at its most murderous. In the rest of Europe, the picture is more mixed. Let's start with Romania. Romania is probably the third most important country to mention in the Holocaust, or the fourth after Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union, because Romania not only had a fairly large Jewish population, but Romania carried out a mass killing policy against Jews on its own. Romania, which also invaded the Soviet Union alongside Germany in 1941, also killed Jews on territory which the Soviets had taken, and killed Jews on territories that it took from the Soviet Union. At least 250,000 Jews, probably more. Romania, unlike Germany, stopped its policy of killing Jews in late 1942. Bulgaria. Now, these German allies are interesting because they set their own policies, which might or might not coincide exactly with what Germany wanted them to do. Bulgaria today is proud of the story that the Bulgarians did not take part in the Holocaust. This is not quite true. Bulgarian Jews did not die in the Holocaust if they were citizens of Bulgaria before the war. But in the territories that Bulgaria took as a German ally, it did send the Jews to Auschwitz or to German-occupied territories to be killed. Hungary was a German ally. It exploited its own Jews terribly, but there was no Holocaust in Hungary until 1944, when Germany occupied Hungarian territory. Slovakia, which I've already mentioned, and Croatia were special cases. These were countries which only existed because of Germany. These are countries which were not entirely sovereign countries during the Second World War. And as a result of this condition, their complete dependency upon Germany, the vast majority of their Jews were murdered over the course of the Holocaust. So, in other words, there's a pattern here, which I mentioned earlier. The destruction of the European order, the destruction of statehood in particular, left Jews very vulnerable. When states were totally destroyed, Jews were at their most vulnerable. The Jews were at their next most vulnerable in places like Slovakia or Croatia, which were entirely dependent upon Germany. Countries that were sovereign, even German allies, show a much more mixed picture. So to make the point a different way, there's an intention to murder all of the Jews. Hitler has a murderous worldview according to which the Jews are responsible for all of the evil on earth. Hitler has an idea that the world can only be restored when Jews are removed physically from earth. There is this aspiration. The aspiration, however, is unevenly fulfilled depending upon essentially political factors. Let me try to make this clear with a couple more examples, and then let me say a word about memory, and then we'll be done. One example which helps make clear how important politics and institutions are is the comparison between Estonia and Denmark. Estonia and Denmark are two small countries on the Baltic Sea, relatively small Jewish populations. Neither has much of a history of anti-Semitism. And yet, the vast majority of the Jews of Denmark survive, and the vast majority of the Jews of Estonia die during the Holocaust. This can't be explained by anti-Semitism or any kind of ethnic factor. It has everything to do with the fact that Denmark was the victim of a relatively gentle German occupation, whereas the Estonian state was destroyed by the Soviet Union, and then Estonian territory was occupied by the Germans, a much harsher combination of factors. A second example which makes this point is the Holocaust in France. What was the most significant victim group in the Holocaust in France? The largest group of victims in the Holocaust in France were not the French Jews. The number one victim group in the Holocaust in France were Polish Jews. Why was that? Well, of course, it's not because of Polish anti-Semitism. They were in France, which is, of course, not to say that Polish anti-Semitism didn't exist. It certainly did. And Polish anti-Semitism was very much a factor in the Holocaust in Poland. I would say it was a factor above all in the murder of Jews after the Second World War in Poland. But when we're looking at France, we can't explain the death of Polish Jews in France that way. We can only explain it a different way. Polish Jews in France were refugees. They had no citizenship, which meant that French authorities were very willing to send them to German death facilities in order to die. For French Jews who were French citizens, it was much more complicated, and most of them were going to survive. Okay, so I've tried to do three things in this lecture. I've tried to give you a sense of the history of Eastern Europe in the first half of the 20th century, from about 1900 to about 1945. I've tried to give you a sense of how the Holocaust proceeded from about 1938, when Austria and Czechoslovakia are destroyed, to the end of the war. I've also tried to give you something like an argument about the causes of the Holocaust, namely that it has much to do with a combination of a German or a Nazi or a Hitlerian aspiration to destroy the Jews of Europe and the world, as it runs up against various political factors, which we understand better when we understand the history. The word that I want to close on is the word memory. It's one of the reasons it's very hard to teach the history of the Holocaust, no matter where you are, whether you're in America or in Russia, whether you're in Latvia or France. is that you run up against issues of memory. You run up against the idea that what your nation did must have been better than what other nations did. You run up against the idea that what other people were anti-Semitic and your people were not. Very often you run up against national myths, which have been cultivated by governments over the decades. You run up against popular ideas that people behaved better than in fact they did. For me, what one has to do in studying the Holocaust and truly remembering the Holocaust is to get past these myths of innocence, whether they're Russian myths of innocence or American myths of innocence, Polish myths of innocence, and look at the general patterns. Look at the rise of states from empires, which is how this history begins. Look at the destruction of these states by new kinds of empires, Soviet and above all, Nazi, and look at the terrible ideas and techniques which were widespread and general under the lands that were occupied by the Germans during the Second World War. Thank you very much.